that process by which bone is formed is that first the cartilage is made, and then the cartilage is transformed into bone. Did you have a question?
Do you want us to enter our last name?
Yes, but I didn't put that up. Thank you for reminding me of that. I'll do that right now. Now it should be coming to you while I'm talking. Okay. And somebody just came in. All right, so the cartilage gets made first, and then that cartilage is transformed into bone. So we see that happen throughout the bone. You know, first we get that primary ossification center, then we get the two secondary ones in the epiphyses, or in the top and bottom part of the bone. And then after birth, this process continues at the epiphyseal plate, and this is the way that bones can continue to get longer. So right here we see that between the epiphysis and the diaphysis is this line or wedge of cartilage. So this is going to become the epiphyseal plate. And essentially what happens there is cartilage is produced at that plate, and it's growing all the time. So it's growing this way. In other words, it's growing towards both ends of the bone. As the cartilage grows, the older cartilage is replaced by bone. So you end up with this kind of sandwich. You have new cartilage that's growing in the center, and it's pushing up and down. But then on the top and bottom of that cartilage plate, we have that cartilage being transformed into bone. So essentially, this part of the bone is getting longer all the time. So the cartilage is replaced by bone. That bone becomes part of the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and the whole thing grows this way. Now, most of the growth is towards the diaphysis, so it's towards the shaft. Otherwise, your epiphyseal plate would keep getting, further and further down if it was growing in both directions. So the primary growth is in this direction only, so the bone grows like this. Now, this occurs all throughout childhood. And the reason for that is the chondrocytes, which are the cells that produce cartilage, they're producing new cartilage just as fast as that cartilage is being transformed into bone. So in a race, they're always keeping up with each other. So new cartilage and new bone are sort of staying neck and neck. So the bone gets longer and longer. Now at puberty, hormones start to slow down that chondrocyte growth. So in that race where bone and cartilage are always keeping up with each other, the bone starts to win. So bone, or the cartilage is turned into bone faster than new cartilage can be made. And eventually, the bone overtakes the cartilage. In other words, there stops being a cartilage plate here at all, and that's the end of bone growth. So we would call that epiphyseal plate closure, or the end of the growing length of that bone. Now, when that is done, there is often on X-ray still a line where you can tell where that epiphyseal plate was. So when we talk about growing bones, we often look at the hand. And the reason for that is in one simple X-ray, that's very easy to do, we can look at, something like, I think it's 18 different bones. So we can see lots of different bones at one time in the hand. So if we look at, the bones of the hand are long bones. So we have an epiphysis here, a diaphysis, and an epiphysis here. And you can see these lines, like here's one, here's one, here's one, there's one up here. These are all epiphyseal plates. So these are growth plates, or these are the spots where cartilage is being produced and then transformed into bone. Cartilage doesn't show up under X-ray. So what we see here is a space. Now, in the real bone, is there a gap there or a break? No, there's not. But this is cartilage here, which shows up as black on X-ray instead of white like bone does. So these are the sites of epiphyseal growth. We can actually tell the bone age or how close a child is to being done getting taller by looking at these hand X-rays. You want to see a nice wide epiphyseal plate where there's a nice big gap. in each of the bones because that's a sign that these bones are still growing and getting larger. Now, once puberty occurs and bone growth stops, what we see is that the epiphyseal cartilages, you can tell how they're much, much narrower here than they were in that other picture. And then after the bone stops growing, we don't see them there at all. So like if we look at this region right here, it's easy to see this line in the growing child, but here it's gone. In a very good x-ray, done at very high quality, you can still often see a line there, but not a gap like you see in the epiphyseal plate. And don't think that this is just occurring in the hand. It's occurring all over the body. So like if you look here, this is the radius, which is the primary bone that connects to the wrist. And you can see that it too has this great big gap right here. And this is the epiphyseal plate of the radius. But then in the grown child or the late teenager, we don't see that gap anymore. And the radius has a little bit of a different shape. So that's epiphyseal closure or growth plate closure. All right.
So would the epiphyseal plate be part of the metaphysis?
Yes. It's in the metaphysis between the epiphyses and the diaphyses. Now, it's important to remember when looking at x-rays of children that epiphyseal lines are normal. If this person had pain in their wrists, let's say, and you looked at this x-ray, you might call that a fracture, right? Because it almost looks like it's broken. So you have to remember that children have these normal lines in their bones, and it's not a fracture, that's where the bone is growing. So you have to be particularly careful reading x-rays in kids. All right. So we've talked about 3 different kinds of bone growth. Appositional growth is how bones get bigger around. Endochondral ossification is how bones get their shape initially, and then how they continue to get longer throughout childhood. The last way that bone is formed is called intramembranous ossification. And your book presents this one in this very complex way, which I don't think is really necessary for you to know. Essentially, there are some bones that form inside of fibrous tissue. So take the skull, for example. In the developing fetus, the skull isn't bone early on. It's actually a fibrous tissue, kind of like leather that surrounds the brain. And what ends up happening is that fibrous tissue starts to form bone inside it, and then eventually it's transformed into bone so that the fibrous tissue doesn't exist anymore. Now, in some ways, it's very similar to endochondral ossification because there are these ossification centers that happen. So, if this is the fibrous membrane, this process starts with, there'll be an area in here that'll start to form into bone, and then that area expands, to include the rest of that, and then eventually what you end up with is a kind of bone sandwich like this, where you have a layer of compact bone on the top and bottom, and then spongy bone in between. And you'll get to see this in lab for yourself, that these bones that form by intramembranous ossification, they end up with 2 parallel compact bone layers with a layer of spongy bone in between. All right. It's all the same players, though. What creates this ossification in this fibrous membrane? Osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts form bone. Eventually, they're trapped inside the bone that they've made and become osteocytes. And then eventually, this spongy bone is how this whole process starts. But then the top and bottom is transformed into compact bone. All right, so that's the last of the 3 is intramembranous ossification. All right, so let's do our first question. Jump in there with your last name if you haven't done that already. All right, because I'm going to close it out. All right, what is the site of longitudinal growth in long bones? And, all right, here we go. Now I can send it. Jump in there if you haven't. All right, I got a few of you on A. The correct answer here is epiphyseal plate. Longitudinal just means long way, so becoming longer. And the site of longitudinal growth in long bones is at that epiphyseal plate, which is in the metaphysis. Why is it not A? The epiphysis is the knobby part at the top and bottom of the bone, so that isn't specific enough. You know, the site of growth is at the epiphyseal plate, where the epiphysis joins with the diaphysis at that region we call the metaphysis. So epiphyseal plate would be true. If metaphysis was an answer, that could also be true. You could also call it the growth plate. This area has multiple different names. All right. So ossification that involves replacing cartilage with bone is called which of those? Oh, we got a spread on this one. All right, so one of the core topics from this chapter is bone growth. Okay, so you have the three different kinds of bone growth. Appositional growth, which is D, that's bones getting bigger around. And there isn't cartilage being replaced by bone in that case. Instead, new bone is forming just inside the periosteum. So the periosteum surrounds the bone. If new bone is forming just inside that, that bone's going to get bigger and bigger around. So that was the first kind we talked about. Appositional growth results in circumferential lamellae, or those regions of compact bone that go all the way around the bone. Endochondral ossification is where chondro is cartilage, so endochondro would be inside cartilage, and this is the replacement of cartilage with bone. So this is how most of the long bones form. This is how the skeleton gets its initial shape. And then it's also the process by which bones get longer at that epiphyseal plate, or that growth plate. So you do have to know what ossification is too. Ossification is transformation into bone, or making bone. Osseous is bone. So, and then the last of the types of growth we talked about was A. Intramembranous ossification is how the flat bones form, and that's where a fibrous membrane is replaced from the inside out by bone to create a flat bone, which is compact bone on top and bottom with spongy bone in between. All right. Another bone growth question. Appositional growth deposits a new layer of bone where? All right, jump in there, last few people. There we go. Okay, so the appositional is to get bigger around. So this is depositing new bone on the surface of the bone. You know, so on the outside of the bone, that outside is wrapped with periosteum, which is a tough membrane that's very tightly bound to the bone. And appositional growth is laying new bone just inside that membrane. So along the surface on the outside of the bone is where we see this appositional growth. All right. We won't do that one. Okay, so let's look at this. Just some of the stuff is just for fun. All right, so this is an embryo at 10 weeks of development, and you can see that other than, and bone is in red, so, you know, we have a little bit of scapula, a little bit of some of the long bones. The rib cage is pretty defined, but you can see how there's no bones in the skull yet. So this is that stage where the skull is essentially just a fibrous membrane. Now, what will happen is that membrane will get transformed into bone. You know, this is just 16 weeks, so this is 6 weeks later. And you can see that while there's no bone here, we're starting to get the flat bones of the skull forming inside of those this membrane that we see here. And there are ossification centers, but are sort of hard to see. So at this stage, most of the skeleton is pure cartilage. You know, that's what comes first. The body creates a cartilage skeleton, and then that cartilage in all the right shapes, and then that cartilage is replaced by bone in that process of endochondral ossification. So like what we're seeing here in some of the larger bones are the primary ossification centers, where those areas on the inside of that cartilage model that are actually being transformed into bone. But then by the time we get to 16 weeks, almost all of the bones of the skeleton are at least identifiable. Now, their shape doesn't look right. You know, like here, the femur, it doesn't go all the way to the knee and it doesn't go all the way to the hip. And the reason for that is those secondary ossification centers that turn the epiphyses, or the ends of the bone, into bone, haven't finished yet. So, you know, and they oftentimes don't entirely finish even before birth. So we have a very identifiable skeleton even just at 16 weeks of development. All right. Well, things go wrong with skeletal growth, and they often stand out because, you know, one of the things that we very easily see about people is, you know, differences in height or body ratio. So just a few here. Here we have a person who's very, very small. This guy would be normal size. This guy is very, very tall. These are examples of pituitary problems affecting growth. If your pituitary gland, which is found at the base of the brain, if it doesn't produce adequate hormones, it doesn't trigger the long bones to grow, so you end up with someone, this is dwarfism, who's very small. If the pituitary is too active, the long bones grow very rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that you can reach, you know, 7 or even 8 feet tall as a result. But if you look at this guy's, you know, body type, you can see that his legs are very long, his arms are very long, compared to his torso, which is not that different from the guy next door here. And that's what you see in pituitary overproduction, is the long bones get very long, but the flat bones, like in the skull and the ribs, are relatively spare. All right. This is a guy with Marfan syndrome, and what you can see is, see how long and skinny his arms and legs are? Marfan syndrome is a genetic disorder that causes changes in collagen. These individuals are usually very tall and very thin, and they one of the cardinal features is their arm span is longer than their height. For most of us, our arm span is less than our height, but for Marfan's patients, their arm span is greater than their height. There's some question as to whether or not Abraham Lincoln may have had Marfan syndrome, because physically he has some of the characteristics of a person with Marfan's. This is achondroplasia, and here, unlike this guy, where, you know, his torso is relatively normal, but his legs are very, very long and arms are very, very long, here we have the opposite issue. We have normal size heads and torsos, but we have very short, long bones. And in achondroplasia, the long bones don't get longer. There's a problem at that growth plate, at that epiphyseal plate, so the long bones don't get, they grow very poorly. Now, they get bigger around, so the appositional growth happens. So in these individuals, their bones are normal weight, but they're very, very short. So we end up with the classic achondroplasia look. Let's see, here's another guy with pituitary problem, gigantism. This guy was probably 8.5 feet tall. In acromegaly, growth hormone is necessary to grow the bones during puberty. But after puberty, growth hormone is supposed to turn off because it's no longer needed. You're grown, so you don't need growth hormone. If growth hormone continues to be secreted, the bones do still respond, but they respond by getting bigger and heavier, not longer. So what you see in this guy's face is he has a very large jaw here, very thick cheekbones, and this is a classic picture of acromegaly, how bones continue to get bigger and heavier in the presence of growth hormone, even if they're not getting longer. Another thing you see in acromegaly is, and you don't see it in this guy, but you can see the nose gets bigger and the ears get bigger as well. All right. And then probably the most, at least visually stunning of the skeletal disorders is this one. This is fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, also called the elephant man syndrome. So what happens here is ossification happens all over the body in places that it shouldn't. Bone is fine where bone is supposed to be, but in FOP, you end up with deposition of bone in muscle, in skin, in any connective tissue in the body. So you end up with profound deformation and a skeleton that doesn't look anything like normal human at all. So just some examples of problems with skeletal growth. All right. So I introduced this topic a couple other times while we were going through this, but bone is alive. It's always changing to meet the body's needs. And we call that process remodeling. So bones are made thinner when we don't use them, thinner and weaker. They're made stronger and heavier when we do use them. In other words, when we bear weight with them, when we put forces into them, the bone actually responds. When you stress a bone, a small electrical field is created because there are ions present, and that electrical field actually triggers the deposition of more bone in that bone. So when we stress our bones, the bones get stronger over time. And the idea here is bone is heavy, and we don't want to carry around any more bone than we need. So our bones are just as strong as we need them to be, not extra strong, which would be carrying around extra weight. So bone is always getting harder, and it's always getting less hard depending on what we're doing. Now, does this happen from day to day? No. This happens over weeks or months. Bone doesn't change rapidly, but over time it does. The sex hormones, which estrogen and progesterone and testosterone primarily, have a major impact on keeping bones strong. So in women, after menopause, when the estrogen and progesterone drop, what we see is bones have a tendency to get porotic, or they develop little tiny holes in them. And the reason for this is without that estrogen or progesterone, it's hard for the bone to hold on to the calcium that makes up, or that makes the bone strong. So we end up with what we call osteoporosis, which I know you have all heard of. But here's what normal spongy bone looks like. You can see that it's very smooth, and there aren't any extra holes there. And then in osteoporosis, we can see that the trabeculi, or these struts, have all these little holes. So you can imagine that this is going to be significantly stronger than this when it comes to bearing weight or transmitting forces from one place or another. All right. So that's one of the changes of bone over time. Bone is relatively complex, so it does need a lot of things to be made. So you need to have all these things in your diet to be able to functionally make new bone. And if you're not able to make new bone, chances are your bones are getting weaker because bone is always being destroyed and remade. All right. So because calcium is so critical for survival, the body uses the skeleton as a way to store calcium. So active calcium in the body is usually in its ionic form. So it's Ca2+. And this is what's important, is the calcium level in the plasma or in the blood. There are three main players in keeping that calcium level normal. So we have bone, we have the intestines where calcium can be absorbed from the food that we eat, and then we have the kidney where excess calcium can be eliminated in the urine. So what we'll see is that by the effects of two main hormones, these three players can be altered to alter the amount of calcium that's found in the bloodstream. So the first one is parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone raises calcium levels when calcium levels get too low. So when calcium levels drop below normal, parathyroid hormone is released, and parathyroid hormone has effects on those three major players in calcium homeostasis. So in the bone, parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclasts. Well, osteoclasts dissolve bone and release calcium. So that kind of makes sense. If the calcium level is low, parathyroid hormone gets the osteoclasts to free up some calcium from the bones, therefore elevating the initial stimuli, the low calcium levels. In the intestine, parathyroid hormone triggers increased absorption. Also makes sense. If our calcium level is low, well, let's pull as much calcium from the food that we're eating as possible to get those levels back up. And then in the kidney, parathyroid hormone reduces the amount of calcium that the kidneys excrete. So the kidneys start holding on to calcium because it's suddenly become precious because the calcium levels are too low. So we get calcium conservation, calcium absorption, and then calcium release from bone, all of which increase the calcium levels in the blood. So parathyroid hormone increases calcium levels by affecting those three major players in calcium homeostasis. Parathyroid hormone comes from the parathyroid glands, which get their name because they are close to the thyroid gland, which is found in the neck. So para is near to, thyroid is thyroid, so these are the parathyroid glands. All right, and you'll hear about them again at the end of this semester when we talk about the endocrine system. All right, so parathyroid hormone works to elevate calcium levels when calcium levels are low. Now it has a brother, calcitonin, which does the opposite. Now, the mnemonic I always learned is calcitonin tones down calcium. So mnemonics, if they work, great. If they don't, they're useless. But that's how I remember it. So calcitonin works to lower calcium levels that have gotten too high. Now, what's interesting is it affects the same three players in calcium homeostasis. So if calcium levels are too high, calcitonin affects the bone by inhibiting osteoclasts and stimulating osteoblasts. So effectively, bone is stimulated to capture the calcium as bone, which would lower the amount of calcium that's out there in the blood, in the plasma. So inhibition of osteoclasts, stimulation of osteoblasts. In the intestine, calcitonin works to reduce absorption. So this makes sense. If our calcium levels are too high, the last thing we want to do is bring in more calcium from the food that we're digesting. So calcitonin kind of turns the digestive system's absorption down to reduce the amount of calcium that's coming in. And then very importantly, calcitonin triggers the kidney to release calcium, to excrete calcium in the urine. Because this is really the best way of getting rid of it. If we have too much calcium around, well, put it in the urine and then it'll be out of the body. So calcitonin causes calcium excretion in the urine. Now, all three of these things, storage of calcium, reduced absorption, and then calcium excretion, all help to lower calcium levels, which is what the initial stimuli for the release of the hormone was in the first place. So calcitonin and parathyroid hormone work in opposition, You know, they work opposite each other. And by having both, we keep our calcium levels in a very narrow range of normal, which is what the body needs. All right. Calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland, specialized cells in the thyroid gland called C cells. So both the parathyroid and calcitonin come from that neck region where the thyroid gland is. All right. So the remodeling of bone tissue is a function of which of those things? All right, I got to get it out to you. So we got a bit of a spread on this one. Okay, so let's talk about remodeling. What I mean by that is remodeling is how bone changes over time so that it's always what we need it to be. So how strong it is, how heavy it is, those things change according to how we use our skeleton. So this kind of remodeling is the balance between osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So it's A. Osteoblasts are making new bone all the time. Osteoclasts are destroying bone all the time. So in this remodeling or keeping the bones as what we need them to be, it's this balance between osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So for example, if you were to start weightlifting, for example, which is going to put additional stress on your skeleton, the balance would shift towards osteoblasts. So there would be more osteoblasts busy in those bones you're using than osteoclasts, which would make those bones stronger and heavier, which is good for lifting weights. Now, let's say, you've decided to take 6 months off and, you're going to couch potato for all that time. Then it's going to shift towards osteoclasts. If you're not stressing the bones, there's no point in having all that strength there. So there'll be more bone dissolving than bone making, and the bones will get a little lighter and a little heavier and a little weaker because you're not using them. So it's osteoblasts and osteoclasts.
Okay, then what do osteocytes do?
Osteocytes are osteoblasts that are all grown up.
That are mature. So,
Yeah.
Then there was a question on the homework that kind of confused me. So osteoblasts actually secrete all of that. But it also said that
they secrete bone.
But what then? So do
osteocytes do too.
Okay.
Osteoblasts do it a lot. The difference is sort of their where they're at. An osteocyte is an osteoblast that has surrounded itself with bone.
So would it
osteoblasts are making new bone around themselves.
So would the osteocyte just maintain that
area
around it?
Yes.
Okay.
The osteocyte just works its little shell, basically. Yeah. Good question. All right, so a calcium homeostasis question. Which of the following regarding calcium homeostasis is true? Yeah.
I can never seem to keep it on my phone. Like I'll put an answer in, and then my phone will disconnect it. And right now it's just a black screen that says it's a server error.
Okay.
So I don't even know if my answers ever come to you.
It's a problem with the system. Now, none of your answers are linked to a grade. Okay, your participation is, but that's different. I know that. What kind of phone do you have?
It's an Android. It's an HTC.
And are you using the Wi-Fi or the over the network?
I think it's just through my phone. So.
Oh, you might. If you have Wi-Fi, you might try that. I know it's not a perfect system. I don't like it, but we're working on something better.
Nobody ever get an HTC.
All right, jump in there, folks. I got 8 answers. There we go. Now they're coming in. That's when you had to think about it a little more, I would imagine. Ooh, okay, we're going to talk about each one of these answers because we got a good spread here. Okay, so parathyroid hormone inhibits osteoclast activity. So we get parathyroid hormone goes up when calcium levels go down, so when calcium is low. So if calcium is low, we want to encourage the osteoclasts to free up that calcium. So it's not going to be A because parathyroid hormone actually stimulates osteoclasts. When blood calcium levels are too low, osteoclast activity increases. That is correct. So parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclasts to release calcium. All right. Increased osteoblast activity increases blood calcium levels. No. Osteoblasts take calcium from the blood and make it into bone. And once that bone's been made, that calcium isn't circulating around the body anymore. So osteoblasts actually are stimulated by the brother of parathyroid hormone, calcitonin, to reduce calcium levels. All right. Parathyroid hormone increases calcium loss from the kidney. Well, we get PTH when levels are low. Well, the last thing we want to do when our levels are low is to lose it in the urine. So we want to hold on to it. We want to conserve it, not excrete it. So there again, calcitonin increases calcium loss from the kidneys, but not parathyroid hormone. And then calcitonin elevates blood calcium levels. Nope, that's parathyroid hormone, increases blood calcium levels. Calcitonin tones them down or turns them down. All right. So our last topic in this chapter is about fracture repair. And as I say in the syllabus, I don't hold you accountable for diseases. So a fracture is technically a pathology. So we talk about this stuff just to give you a sense of why are we learning this stuff anyway. Not that this is testable material. But so bone heals itself. Initially, the immediate thing that happens after a fracture is a hematoma. We learned when we first started talking about this chapter that bone is very vascular. When we look at the bones in lab, we don't get that part of it because they're dried out, they have no circulation, so they're cold and dead, so to speak. But in life, bones are very much warm and alive and full of blood. So when we get a fracture, like we have a mid-shaft break here, we get lots of bleeding because blood vessels have been disrupted, so we get bleeding. Now covering the outside of the bone is that periosteum. So the blood can't get out and down because that periosteum is like super tough. So you end up with this blood clot that basically surrounds that fracture. So that's step one, is hematoma. Step two is sort of an internal and external splint. What the body wants to do is make sure that the two ends of the bone stay in alignment, because if the two ends of the bone get out of alignment, that bone is not going to heal properly. So one of the first, we splint the outside, with wood or plaster, but even on the inside, the body is kind of working on a splint too. So on the inside surface, so let's see, if here's our bone and here's the marrow cavity, so there's an inside surface and an outside surface, right? Well, on the inside surface, we get what's called the internal callus. So some spongy bone forms to sort of to keep the inner surface in line. And then on the outside, we get a cartilage callus that forms to keep the outside lined up as well. So we have an internal and an external callus that kind of creates a splint or a strut to keep those bones aligned. And then eventually the cartilage is replaced by bone, so both inside and outside. So now our cartilage, our hematoma, and our internal callus have all been replaced by spongy bone. Now, that looks kind of sloppy. I mean, we don't have the nice lines that we have in compact bone, but this is what happens first. Yeah?
So when you have a fracture or a break like that, does it always feel like that in the picture? Do you always get that one?
No, this is temporary. So this is the first part, or the first time we could call the bone healed because it's all bone again. But no, this external callus goes away. It's remodeled, and eventually, after a year or more, you often won't be able to tell where that fracture was. So yeah, the external callus is temporary, yeah.
when you fracture or break a bone, does it always have hematoma? Because I've broken my scapula and fractured my radius, and I don't remember ever having those hematomas.
Well, you wouldn't know that you did.
Like it doesn't.
No, you wouldn't see it because all that blood stays underneath the periosteum. So you probably did.
Before where it's like literally.
Yeah, it's not one you can see. It's around the bone. There's a hematoma, big blood clot there. Yeah, it's one of the reasons that broken bones hurt so bad. Is this hematoma stretches that periosteum and it causes a great deal of pain. So yeah. All right. So this is totally just for fun, but these are some of the different fracture types that you can see. So the classic fracture is what's called the transverse. This is a break across the long axis. So, you know, in a football hit, for example, that comes from the side, you're probably going to get a snapped tibia, you know, mid-shaft like this, so that's a transverse fracture. These heal very well as long as you can put the two ends reasonably close together so that they can heal correctly. In a spiral fracture, there's been a twisting motion to the bone, and you know, just like if you took a piece of wood or a twig and you twisted it to break it, instead of breaking straight, it would break in kind of a spiral around. That's a spiral fracture where you get spinning forces into a bone. So you remember, you have to think in 3 dimensions. These are 2-dimensional pictures of a 3-dimensional thing. So like this spiral kind of goes down and around like that. One of the characteristics of a fracture is it displaced or non-displaced? In a displaced fracture, the two ends are not where they should be, so they've separated. And in a non-displaced fracture, which this is pretty much one, the two ends are still sort of lined up. So the difference is in treatment. You know, if we have a displaced fracture like this, we're going to have to tug and pull on that bone to try to get it back in alignment, or else it's never going to heal right. Even to the extent of going into surgery to put those bones, to line them back up so that they'll heal properly. All right. In a compression fracture, we see these primarily in the vertebrae, and it's a crush fracture. So we see these in osteoporosis oftentimes, or in injuries where a person has fallen from a height onto their feet or fallen from a height onto their backside, and where the forces are lined up. Because essentially the vertebrae, if exposed to enough force, will crush. So that's what we call a compression fracture, right? That crushing injury. It's hard to show in this picture, but here's a normal vertebrae here and one up here, and you can see how this one has been like demolished. You know, it's supposed to look like this, but instead it's all flattened. And you can see this kind of shrapnel pushing out here. That would be probably a compression fracture from a fall. A green stick fracture happens particularly in children, and this is where one side of the bone breaks but not the other. And it gets its name because if you were to go out to a living tree and take a twig off and try to break it, what happens is one side breaks but the other side doesn't, right? Because it's flexible. We see that happen in children because their bones are quite a bit more flexible than adults are. So a green stick fracture, you know, this would result from an injury from, you know, pushing in this direction away from the arrow. So the outside part of the bone broke, but this part didn't because it was flexible enough to endure that. All right. Another fracture characteristic is comminuted versus non-comminuted. In a comminuted fracture, you have many bone pieces. You know, so these are traumatic fractures, gunshot injuries, car accidents, stuff like that, where enough force has been put into the bone that some pieces of it have shattered. So you have pieces of bone everywhere. So like this is a femur fracture. Just here's the head of the femur. So this was probably from a car accident. And you can see all these little bone shards in here. These need surgery because these bone pieces have to be removed, and usually a comminuted fracture is displaced because there isn't enough remaining intact bone where the break is to have things line up right. All right. Yeah, and in an epiphyseal fracture, these are the ones we worry about in kids. That growth plate that we talked about today is the weakest part of the bone while it's present. Cartilage is not as strong as bone. So if you impart high forces to that bone, there's a tendency for the bone to slide on that epiphyseal plate. So like, you know, if this is your, try that again. If this is your bone here, and this is your epiphyseal plate, if you were to put pressure there, this has a tendency to slide this way. So you end up with, like we see in our picture here. Do you see how, this is the knee, okay, so this is the tibia, this is the end of the femur. Do you see how this thing sticks out here? This belongs, if you could somehow take that and slide it over, that's the way it's supposed to be. So what's happened here is the femur has slid on its distal epiphyseal plate because that growth plate is the weakest part. Now, all fractures that involve the growth plate should be handled by an orthopedic surgeon, preferably a pediatric orthopedic surgeon, because any damage to the growth plate can result in uneven bone growth in that region. So we always worry about epiphyseal fractures in kids because it can cause problems later on, like one arm shorter than the other, one leg longer than the other, that kind of thing. All right. And then two very common fractures. A pot fracture happens when you fall on your legs. So, you know, you fall off a ladder and you manage to not hit your head, but instead you landed right on your legs. You may end up with a pot fracture as all that force comes down into your feet. The end of the tibia and fibula sort of slide off. So you can see here's the ankle, and this doesn't look quite lined up, you know, so it should be nice and straight, so we have this kind of angle like that. So that's a Pott's fracture. And then in a Colles fracture, these happen when you, what we call foosh, or fall on an outstretched hand. So when you trip and fall, nature's instinct is you put your arms out in front of you, right, to protect the noggin from hitting the concrete. Well, when you do that, you might end up with a Colles fracture where the distal bones of the arm both break as all those forces are absorbed. Essentially, your hand and wrist are shoved up in between the two bones of your forearm. So you can end up with a both bone fracture or a Colles fracture. All right. So just an exploration of some bones. Here's the fun that the orthopedic surgeons get to have. We call them the carpenters of medicine because when they go into surgery, they have screwdrivers and drills and screws and plates and all that good stuff. So here's a massively displaced femur fracture. You know, here's one end, here's another. What would you do with that? Well, you're going to do something like this. You're going to get your plates and your screws, and your orthopedic surgeon is going to screw everything back in place so that it can heal naturally. Now, these are not the same fracture because they're different bones involved, but it's just the kind of thing that our friendly orthopedic surgeons do to put bones together, just like carpentry.
Do they remove them?
Sometimes they remove the screws and plates. Sometimes they're in there forever. All right, so that's it, everybody. End of the new material. We will do some review next time, and then our test on Friday. Yeah.
I used to play basketball, and I used to always hear that.